It was just before 9 o'clock in the morning on July 2nd, 1937, in the cramped radio room of a United States Coast Guard cutter anchored off a tiny speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The radio men aboard the Itasca had been awake all night, straining to hear a single voice through the static. And then, suddenly, it came through, loud, clear, and desperate. A woman's voice on the edge of tears, calling out a line of position, a frequency, a direction. And then, nothing. The voice belonged to Amelia Earhart, the most famous female aviator in the world, and those were the last words anyone would ever officially hear from her. For nearly 9 decades, her disappearance was called the greatest unsolved mystery of the modern age. But that word, unsolved, no longer fits. Because when investigators pieced together all of the evidence, the radio logs, a forgotten photograph analyzed by Pentagon experts, the bone measurements, the artifacts recovered from a lonely, uninhabited island, the mystery dissolves into an answer. We now know why Amelia Earhart vanished, down to a chain of small, preventable mistakes, and one single switch inside her cockpit that, had she flipped it, would very likely have saved her life. And we know where she ended up, and where her airplane is resting at this very moment. This is the story of how the Amelia Earhart mystery was finally solved. But to understand how she was lost, we have to go back. By 1937, Amelia Earhart was not just a pilot, she was a global celebrity, a symbol of what women could achieve in an age that constantly told them what they couldn't. Her fame began in 1928, when she became the first female passenger to cross the Atlantic by airplane. But being, in her own words, little more than cargo never sat well with her. She wanted to fly it herself. And in 1932, she did, alone, through storms and ice, landing 14 grueling hours later in a northern Irish pasture, her face so blackened with grease that a farmhand couldn't tell whether she was a man or a woman. He asked if she had flown far. "From America," she replied. The flight made her the first woman to pilot a plane solo across the Atlantic, and it opened doors at the highest levels of American power. She used those connections skillfully, eventually securing something essential to her greatest ambition, a runway on a remote island almost nobody had ever heard of. Because by 1937, Earhart wanted to become the first woman to fly around the entire world, and not by any shortcut. Her route would follow the equator, the longest possible path around the planet, and it saved the hardest challenge for last, crossing the full width of the Pacific. Her aircraft was a twin-engine Lockheed Electra 10E, purchased with funds raised largely through Purdue University. It had been rebuilt into a flying fuel tank, the cabin insulation ripped out to save weight, leaving engine noise so deafening that she and her navigator had to pass handwritten notes, and the passenger seats replaced by enormous fuel tanks. Even so, from Lae in New Guinea, Hawaii lay beyond the Electra's maximum range. She needed somewhere to refuel. Halfway between Australia and Hawaii lies Howland Island, a strip of sand and coral just over 2 kilometers long and less than 1 wide. It had no runway until Earhart made one appear. When red tape stalled the airstrip project, she wrote directly to President Franklin Roosevelt, asking him to forgive a troublesome female flyer for whom the Howland project was the key to her world flight. The funds were approved 4 days later, and 3 runways were cleared. She now had a place to land. The question was how on earth she would find it. Beside Earhart flew Fred Noonan, one of the most experienced aerial navigators alive, the man who had plotted Pan American's pioneering clipper routes across the Pacific. His first tool was dead reckoning. From compass bearing, airspeed, and wind, he could estimate how long the journey to Howland should take. But there was a clever twist. They would not aim directly at the island, because if it failed to appear on time, they would have no idea whether they had drifted north or south. Instead, they deliberately aimed to one side, so that when the clock ran out, they would know with certainty which way to turn. His second tool was celestial navigation. Star sights gave him circles of possible position on the globe, and where 2 circles crossed, there they were. It was elegant, but not perfect. Earlier in this very journey, haze and small errors had caused them to miss an entire airport in Africa, where it didn't matter. Over the Pacific, aiming for a speck of coral, the same error would be fatal, which is why the entire plan rested on a third technology, still remarkably new in 1937, radio. Remember it, because it is the key both to why she vanished and to how we know what happened to her. The Electra bristled with no fewer than 5 antennas, each with a specific job. There was a long trailing wire antenna, 76 meters of it, reeled out behind the plane like a fishing line, long because the low frequencies ships used for direction finding, around 400 to 500 kilohertz, need long antennas. 2 more antennas handled voice on higher frequencies, which cross enormous distances by bouncing off the ionosphere, a charged layer high above the Earth that reflects radio waves like a great wobbly mirror. By day, aviators used 6210 kilohertz, by night, 3105. And finally, there were the 2 antennas that mattered most, a rotating loop above the cockpit, and a sense antenna. By rotating the loop, a pilot could find the precise orientation at which a signal dropped to silence, a null, and that null pointed straight toward the transmitter, a compass that pointed not north, but toward whoever was broadcasting. Earhart herself admitted she would never have dared attempt tiny Howland without this equipment. It was her lifeline, and through a cascade of misunderstandings, it would fail her completely. The warning signs had appeared months earlier. In March of 1937, on her first attempt at the world flight, she carried a third crew member, Harry Manning, an expert in radio, Morse code, and navigation. That first leg succeeded partly because Manning used the loop antenna to home in on a radio beacon in Hawaii. But 3 days later, taking off for Howland, the landing gear collapsed and the Electra ground to a halt on its belly. The plane needed months of repairs, and most consequentially of all, Manning left the crew. When the Electra rose from the runway at Leh on that hot July morning, the only radio expert who had ever flown with her was gone. So was something else. During the repairs, the long trailing antenna, the only one that could transmit on the low frequencies ships could take bearings on, had been removed. It was Morse only, and neither Earhart nor Noonan was fluent in Morse. To Earhart, it was deadweight. In hindsight, it was the first link in a fatal chain. The chain tightened quickly. 20 minutes after takeoff, Leh radioed a warning of stronger headwinds ahead. She never acknowledged it, nor the calls that followed. 4 hours in, she transmitted her own report, everything okay, with no mention of the warnings. In all likelihood, she never heard them. Something was wrong with her ability to receive, perhaps a belly antenna torn away on takeoff, perhaps a fault in the receiver itself. Whatever the cause, Amelia Earhart was flying into the largest ocean on Earth, able to talk, but not able to listen. 9 hours in, she expected to pass the Ontario, a U.S. Navy ship stationed at the midpoint precisely, so she could take a radio bearing on it. But the telegram carrying her instructions never reached the ship in time. The Ontario sat silent in the darkness below as the plane droned past overhead. They missed each other completely. Earhart now faced a decision in the dark. Turn back to Leh, or press on toward a 2-kilometer island guarded by a single Coast Guard cutter. She pressed on. Around 6:15 a.m., the radiomen aboard the Itasca finally heard her, asking them to take a bearing on her voice at 3105 kilohertz. The men were baffled. Their direction-finding equipment only worked on low frequencies. Her voice signal, up at 3105, skipped off the ionosphere and scattered off the ocean, arriving from everywhere at once. There was no null to find. And when they tried to tell her, she heard only static. Then came the cruelest twist, time itself. Earhart was navigating on Greenwich time. The Itasca's clocks ran 11.5 hours behind. Howland's, 10.5. 3 parties meeting on a pinprick of land were operating on 3 different clocks. So when she said she would listen on the half hour, the Itasca understood something entirely different. And on top of it all sat one final, terrible error. A radio expert in Leh had recommended the Itasca send Morse signals on 750, meaning 750 meters of wavelength, which is 400 kilohertz, well within the range her loop could home on. But in relaying the plan, Earhart wrote 7500 kilohertz, a frequency her loop could hear but never take a bearing from. She even added, "If the frequencies mentioned are unsuitable, inform me." No one ever did. At 7:42 a.m., her voice burst through so loudly that sailors ran up on deck, scanning the sky. "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low." 10 minutes later, "We are circling, but cannot hear you. Go ahead on 7500. The Itasca instantly obeyed, hammering out Morse code on 7500 kilohertz. And inside the Electra, for the first time in nearly a full day, Earhart heard them. She spun her direction-finding loop, hunting for the null that would point her home. It never came. The frequency was too high. The scattering waves arrived from every direction, and the signal never dropped out. She had heard her rescuers, and it told her nothing. Her final message came just before 9 a.m., her voice ragged with desperation. "We are on the line 157337, running north and south." And that message, dismissed for decades as the last cry of a doomed pilot, is the single most important clue in the entire case. Amelia Earhart told the world exactly where she was going, but nobody understood it in time. The search that followed was the most intensive and expensive rescue operation in American history to that point. Not a trace was officially found, and on January 5, 1939, Amelia Earhart was declared legally dead. Into that blank space rushed the theories, so let's eliminate the ones that don't fit. Captured by the Japanese and died on Saipan. The photograph that supposedly showed her alive in the Marshall Islands turned out to appear in a Japanese travel book published in 1935, 2 years before she vanished. Crashed into the open ocean near Howland and sank. The dramatic 2024 sonar image from 5,000 meters down turned out to be a natural rock formation, and decades of sonar sweeps around Howland have never produced a single bolt of the Electra. and there is a good reason for that. The Electra never went down in the open ocean at all. Follow her last words. "We are on the line 157337. That line of position runs northwest to southeast through Howland, and to the northwest lies nothing but empty water. Trace it southeast about 650 kilometers, and it passes almost directly over an uninhabited coral atoll then called Gardner Island, known today as Nikumaroro. For a lost pilot trained to fly a line until land appears, Nikumaroro is precisely where the procedure would deliver her. And this is where the case stops being a theory. Exhibit 1. A photograph. In October 1937, just 3 months after the disappearance, a British officer named Eric Bevington photographed Nikumaroro's reef, and at the edge of the frame, unnoticed for 70 years, a small object pokes out of the water. And when researchers spotted it in 2010, the image went to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and independent experts at the Pentagon agreed with forensic imaging specialist Jeff Glickman. Its geometry matches, component for component, the landing gear of a Lockheed Electra. Aircraft wreckage photographed on the exact reef her final message points to, decades before anyone thought to look there. Exhibit 2. The radio signals. In the days after her disappearance, operators across the Pacific picked up faint distress calls on Earhart's frequencies, a woman's voice pleading for help, and the Electra could not transmit from the water. No engine to drive the generator, no signal. Every genuine call meant the plane was on land, upright, with an engine running. Pan American Airways turned its direction-finding stations at Wake, Midway, and Honolulu toward those calls and took bearings. And on the map, the bearings cross at the Phoenix Islands, the tiny group that contains Nikumaroro. The same answer as the photograph, reached independently by physics. Exhibit 3. The Castaway. In 1940, a British officer discovered a partial human skeleton on the island, alongside a sextant box and remnants of a woman's shoe. The bones were misjudged as male and lost, but the measurements survived. And in 2018, forensic anthropologist Richard Jantz reanalyzed them with modern methods. The castaway was more similar to Amelia Earhart than 99% of a large reference population. In 2017, 4 forensic dogs trained to detect human remains all alerted at the very site where the skeleton was found. And around that campsite lay fragments of the anti-freckle cream Earhart was known to use, a woman's compact and improvised tools. A photograph, radio bearings, a skeleton, a castaway's camp, 4 independent lines of evidence converging on one tiny ring of coral sitting on the line 157337. And the final exhibit is emerging from the water right now. In 2020, satellite imagery revealed an elongated anomaly in Nikumaroro's shallow lagoon, roughly 12 meters long. The Electra's fuselage is 12.2 meters. They call it the Taraya object, and it lies exactly where the tides would have dragged a plane parked on that reef. This October, an expedition organized by the Archaeological Legacy Institute and Purdue University, the very institution that funded Earhart's Electra, sails from Tarawa to put sonar, drones, and metal detectors directly on it, with recovery planned as early as next year. 89 years after she vanished, her airplane is finally about to be touched. Which brings us to the most haunting detail of all, how easily she might never have been lost. Her loop antenna could hear voice across a wide range of frequencies, even though it could only take bearings on low ones. Had she flipped the switch to route her listening through that loop, she would have heard the Itasca's voice, learned about the frequency mistake, and been sent a signal she could actually home in on. One switch, one conversation. And the most famous disappearance of the 20th century simply never happens. So here is what really happened to Amelia Earhart. She took off with a radio she could talk on but not listen with. A missed telegram silenced the Ontario. A misread wavelength made the Itasca invisible to her direction finder. 3 clocks told 3 different times. And when Howland refused to appear, she ran her line, 157337, southeast toward the only land it offered, reached Nikumaroro, and put the Electra down on the flat coral reef at low tide. For days she ran the engine and called into the static, while the rising tide dragged the plane toward the lagoon, which is why the search planes that finally roared overhead saw only an empty island. The woman who conquered the Atlantic died not in a crash, but as a castaway, a photograph of her landing gear, radio bearings crossing over her island, a skeleton matching her body, her freckle cream in the sand, and a plane-sized object in the lagoon waiting for its divers. That is not an unsolved mystery. That is a case file closed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed watching this mystery finally come apart, don't forget to like and subscribe and tell us in the comments. When they raise the Taraya object, what do you think they'll find inside? Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.